The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and expensive cologne, and I remember thinking, right before it happened, that I had picked the wrong blazer for a day I was supposed to lose everything in. I was 34 years old, sitting at a long mahogany table across from the man I had been married to for 9 years, and he would not stop smiling. Not a happy smile. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he has already won something and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the outcome he decided on weeks ago. Marcus Whitfield had built an entire career reading rooms like this one, reading people the way other men read box scores, and he was reading me now like I was a formality standing between him and lunch. His attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Vance who wore her authority the way some women wear perfume, slid a document across the table and tapped it twice with a manicured nail. "This is where your side lists claimed income," she said, looking at my attorney instead of me, which was its own kind of insult. "Under assets and earnings, your client has listed a blog." She said the word blog the way you might say a stain you found on a white couch. Something unfortunate. Something that needed to be addressed and then quietly forgotten. Marcus leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and let out a short laugh through his nose, the kind of laugh a man gives when he wants everyone in the room to know he finds something adorable and beneath serious discussion. "It's not income," Marcus said, still looking at Patricia, still not looking at me. "It's a hobby. She writes about casseroles and budgeting tips for stay-at-home moms. It keeps her busy. I'm not saying that to be cruel, I'm saying it because it's true, and we all need to deal in what's true here today." He had the decency, if you could call it that, to glance at me for half a second after he said it, checking to see if I would flinch. I did not flinch. I had spent 412 days learning not to flinch in front of Marcus Whitfield, and on that particular Tuesday in March, sitting in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building I did not yet know I would one day own, I did not give him the satisfaction. What Marcus did not know, what none of the 4 attorneys in that room knew, what not even my own lawyer fully understood yet because I had not told her everything, was that the blog he had just called a hobby had cleared $1.1 million in revenue the year before. Not from ads. Not from sponsored posts about laundry detergent, although there had been a few of those in the early days, back when I was grateful for anything. It came from a course I had built teaching women how to read a balance sheet, how to understand where their household money actually went, how to ask the right questions before they signed anything a man in a nice suit put in front of them. It came from a membership community of 43,000 women who paid $9 a month to feel less alone in rooms exactly like the one I was sitting in. It came from consulting work I did anonymously, under a pen name Marcus had never once asked me about, for small business owners who needed someone who understood both spreadsheets and the particular exhaustion of being underestimated. The blog was called The Kitchen Ledger. Marcus had walked past my laptop 1,000 times while I worked on it at our kitchen island, and he had never once asked what was on the screen, because in his mind, whatever I did at that laptop was adjacent to dinner, and therefore beneath his curiosity. I did not correct him in that conference room. I let him say his piece. I let Patricia Vance nod along like he had just delivered closing arguments to a jury of one. I folded my hands on the table and I thought about the years before this one, because that is where a person's spine actually gets built, not in the moment of confrontation but in all the small moments leading up to it that nobody bothers to notice. I met Marcus when I was 26 and still practicing corporate law myself, still believing that the version of success I had been taught to want was the only version that counted. He was 3 years ahead of me, already making partner track noise at his firm, already the kind of confident that made rooms quiet down when he walked into them. He proposed on a Tuesday, which he thought was charming and unexpected, and I said yes because he made me laugh in a way that felt like relief after years of being tightly wound, and because I believed, the way you believe things at 26, that a person's early kindness is a reliable predictor of their permanent character. For a while it was. I want to be fair about that, even now, even narrating this to you from the other side of everything that happened, because a story is only useful if it is honest, and the honest version is that Marcus was not always a man who laughed at me across conference tables. He used to bring me coffee in the mornings without being asked. He used to listen, actually listen, when I talked about cases at the firm, back when I still had a firm of my own to talk about. The shift happened slowly enough that I could not point to a single day and say, that was when he started looking through me instead of at me. It happened somewhere in the space between my decision to leave corporate law, which I made after a partner screamed at a junior associate hard enough to make her cry in the bathroom, and I realized I did not want to become someone who thought that was normal, and Marcus's own rise to owning his firm outright, a rise that came with new suits, new colleagues, and a new paralegal named Chelsea Reyes who started working for him the same year I started writing under a pen name because I did not yet trust myself to put my real name on anything that might fail. Chelsea was 29 when she started at the firm. I met her exactly once, at a holiday party held in a rented ballroom with too much gold trim and not enough ventilation, back when I still thought of her as one of Marcus's employees rather than as a fact I would spend a year learning to live with. She had a way of touching people's forearms when she talked to them, a small gesture that read as warmth if you did not look too closely at who she was touching and how often. I remember watching her hand rest on Marcus's sleeve for a beat longer than professional distance required, and I remember the specific, quiet, unglamorous feeling that moved through me. Not jealousy exactly. Recognition. The kind of recognition you get when your body understands something before your mind is ready to. I did not say anything that night. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I had been working too hard on the membership platform launch and my nerves were simply frayed in a way that was making me read too much into an innocent gesture. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this part of the story because I think you will be surprised by what came next. Most of you listening already know what came next, because most of you have lived some version of it yourselves, which is exactly why I am telling it slowly. Some betrayals arrive all at once, a single terrible sentence spoken in a kitchen at midnight. Mine arrived the way water gets into a foundation, quietly, through a crack so small you convince yourself it is nothing, until one day you notice the floor is not level anymore. The proof came 4 months after that holiday party, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in October, while I was doing something as unremarkable as looking for the good scissors in Marcus's home office desk drawer. I was not looking for anything else. I want to be precise about that, because precision is something I value, something my years of legal training beat into me long before Marcus ever tried to use that same precision against me in a settlement negotiation. I opened the second drawer down, the one that stuck slightly and required a small lift to clear the frame, and beneath a stack of old Bar Association newsletters he never read, I found a folded hotel receipt from a boutique property 40 minutes outside the city, dated 3 weeks earlier, a Tuesday when Marcus had told me he was in Cleveland for a deposition. The room was booked for 2. I did not confront him that night. This is the part people sometimes find hard to understand about me, and I have made peace with the fact that not everyone will understand it, but I am telling you anyway because it is true and because I think there is something valuable in it. I did not scream. I did not throw the receipt at his chest when he walked in the door that evening smelling like his own cologne layered over something floral that was not mine. I made dinner. I set the table. I waited until he had taken exactly 3 bites of the chicken I had roasted, and then I asked him, in a voice that surprised me with how steady it was, whether Cleveland had gone well. He said it had. He said the deposition ran long. He said he was exhausted and had ordered room service and gone straight to bed. I let him finish the sentence. I let him take a 4th bite. Then I set the folded receipt on the table beside his plate, smoothed it flat with 2 fingers, and asked him to tell me again about Cleveland. I will not narrate every detail of what happened in the 20 minutes that followed, because some of it is not mine alone to give away, and because the specifics matter less than the shape of it. What matters is this. Marcus did not apologize. He did not reach for my hand or drop his head into his palms the way men do in the version of this scene you see in movies, the version where remorse looks clean and immediate and easy to forgive. What Marcus did, sitting at our dinner table with a hotel receipt between us like a verdict, was get irritated. Genuinely, visibly irritated, the way you get irritated at a delay, an inconvenience, a problem that has surfaced at an inconvenient time and is now going to cost him something he had not budgeted for. You went through my desk, he said, like that was the crime under discussion. I did not go through your desk, I told him. I was looking for scissors. You left a receipt from a hotel 40 minutes from here for a night you told me you were in Cleveland. He did not deny it after that. I will give him that much, in the interest of fairness, in the interest of telling this story the way it actually happened rather than the way it would feel more satisfying to tell it. He did not deny it. He simply stopped performing the version of himself that pretended nothing was wrong, and what was underneath that performance was not guilt. It was impatience. He talked about stress. He talked about how demanding the firm had become, how much pressure he was under, how Chelsea understood the pressures of his work in a way that, and here he actually said this, in a way that someone who had left the legal field could not fully understand anymore. I remember sitting very still and thinking, with a kind of clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, that he had just told me, without meaning to, exactly how he had come to justify it to himself. Not as a betrayal. As a natural consequence of my own inadequacy. I had left the practice of law to build something of my own, something he had never bothered to understand, and in his mind that made me less than her, less relevant, less worthy of the honesty he still believed, on some level, he owed to a partner he respected. I did not cry that night, not in front of him. I want to tell you that part clearly because I think it matters, not because tears are weakness, they are not, I have cried plenty since, but because in that specific moment what I felt was not grief. It was the sensation of a door closing somewhere inside my chest, quietly, without slamming, the kind of closing that does not announce itself but that you understand, even as it happens, is permanent. I filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Marcus did not fight the filing itself. What he fought, what he brought 4 attorneys and a conference room and a full quarter of billable hours to fight, was the division of what he believed we had built together, using a definition of together that conveniently erased every hour I had spent building something he never once asked about. Which brings us back to that conference room on the 9th floor, back to Marcus leaning back in his chair with his fingers laced behind his head, telling Patricia Vance and my own attorney and the court reporter typing quietly in the corner that my blog was a hobby, that it kept me busy, that we all needed to deal in what was true. Here is what was true. What was true was that I had spent the 18 months since finding that receipt building something Marcus had never once looked closely enough to see. What was true was that the kitchen ledger had grown from a handful of readers I had told approximately no one about into a business with real revenue, real infrastructure, and a small but fiercely loyal team of 3 women I had hired without Marcus's knowledge because I had learned, slowly and then all at once, that some things you build more safely in the dark. What was also true, and this is the part one had not yet told anyone in that room, not my own attorney, not my sister, not the forensic accountant I would call the following week, was that the holding company I had quietly formed 2 years earlier to manage the income from my course sales and consulting work had, in the last 8 months, begun acquiring small commercial properties in the city. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have made headlines. Just careful, unglamorous purchases made through an entity called Fieldstone Row, a name I had chosen because it sounded like nothing in particular, which was exactly the point. Marcus finished his little speech about hobbies and casseroles, and Patricia Vance moved on to the next line item as though the matter had been settled, as though a man's confident dismissal was itself a form of legal proof. I looked at my own attorney, a careful, unshowy woman named Renata Alvarez who had come recommended by a friend from my old law school class, and I gave her the smallest possible nod, the kind of nod that says not yet, but soon. Renata cleared her throat and said we would need additional time to properly value my client's business interests before this settlement moves forward, and Patricia Vance sighed the specific sigh of someone who believes they are being asked to indulge a delay that will change nothing. Marcus checked his watch. He had somewhere else to be. He always had somewhere else to be, and for 9 years I had organized my entire life around making room for the places he needed to go, and I sat in that conference room and watched him check his watch one more time, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost gentle, that this would be the last time in my life I rearranged anything for Marcus Whitfield's schedule. The meeting ended without resolution, which Patricia Vance clearly considered a minor inconvenience and I considered a small mercy, because it gave me room to breathe before the next round. Marcus walked out ahead of me, already checking his phone, already halfway back into the life he had built without me in it. I stayed behind for a moment, gathering my things slowly, watching through the glass wall as he stopped in the hallway to take a call, laughing at something the person on the other end said, easy and unbothered, a man who believed the hardest part of his day was already behind him. I want to tell you honestly that I did not yet know, standing there gathering my folder and my coat, exactly how this would end. I did not know about the building yet, not really, not in any way I could have named out loud. I did not know about Sam, or the coffee I would eventually let myself have on my own time for my own reasons, or the specific silence that would cross Marcus's face 9 months later in a much smaller room than this one. I only knew, standing in that hallway with my coat over my arm, watching my ex-husband laugh into his phone 30 feet away, that I was done being someone people underestimated in rooms with mahogany tables. I had spent 9 years being told, in 1,000 small ways, that what I built quietly did not count as building. I had let that go unchallenged for longer than I am proud of, because challenging it felt exhausting in a marriage that was already asking so much of me in other ways. But there is a particular kind of tired that turns into resolve if you let it sit long enough, and by the time I walked out of that building and into the cold March afternoon, I had stopped being tired in the way that makes a person quiet, and started being tired in the way that makes a person exact. Marcus had called my blog a hobby in front of 2 attorneys and a court reporter, and somewhere in the recording of that meeting, preserved in the careful, boring language of a legal transcript, was a man on record underestimating the woman he was trying to outnegotiate. I did not know it yet, standing on that sidewalk, but he was also, at that very moment, a tenant of a company I owned, in a building he had never once thought to ask who actually held the deed to. I would not find that out for another few weeks. But I want you to sit with that fact for a moment the way I eventually got to sit with it, because there is a specific kind of satisfaction in knowing something before the people who wronged you do, and I promise you, before this story is over, you are going to understand exactly how satisfying that can be. For now, though, I want to take you back further, to the rock bottom I had not yet hit on that March afternoon, because underestimating me was not the only mistake Marcus was going to make that year, and the ground still had a little further to fall before I found the floor I would eventually build something new on top of. Rock bottom did not announce itself with a single crash. It arrived the way most real collapses do, in a series of smaller losses that each felt survivable on their own, until I added them together one sleepless night and realized I was looking at the wreckage of an entire life. The first loss was the house. Not the marriage, I had already made peace with losing that, but the house itself, the one with the blue front door I had painted myself on a Saturday afternoon 3 years earlier while Marcus was at a golf outing he considered more important than helping me choose a color. Marcus's attorney filed for temporary exclusive use of the marital residence, arguing that Marcus needed stability to continue running his firm during the proceedings, as though stability was a resource only available to people with law degrees hanging on their walls. The judge granted it. I was given 30 days to collect my belongings and find somewhere else to live, and I remember standing in the kitchen on the last night, running my hand along the counter where I had built an entire business typing quietly after midnight while Marcus slept upstairs assuming I was scrolling something mindless, and feeling the specific grief of leaving a place that had never really been mine in the way I had always pretended it was. The second loss was quieter and somehow sharper. Word travels fast in the particular ecosystem Marcus and I had lived in for 9 years, a world of country club dinners and firm holiday parties and charity galas where everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew their own. I stopped getting invited to things. Not all at once, not with any single dramatic snub, but gradually, the way a name gets quietly dropped from a list. Women I had considered friends, women I had hosted in my kitchen and cried with over lesser problems, began sending shorter texts and slower replies. I understood, eventually, that most of them were not choosing Marcus over me out of malice. They were choosing the version of the story that required less complication, the version where a successful attorney's marriage simply did not work out, rather than the version where he had lied to my face for over a year while a woman half his conscience touched his sleeve at a holiday party. The third loss was the one that still catches in my throat a little, even now, even with everything that came after. I saw Chelsea for the first time since the divorce filing on a Saturday morning at the farmer's market I had gone to every week for 6 years, the one with the woman who sold sourdough out of a converted horse trailer and always saved me the loaf with extra rosemary. Chelsea was there with Marcus, laughing at something, her hand doing that same thing it had always done, resting on his forearm a beat too long, and I watched him lean down and kiss the top of her head in the exact spot he used to kiss mine, at the exact market I had introduced him to, and something in me went very quiet and very still, the way a room goes still right before a storm actually arrives. I did not approach them. I turned around, walked back to my car without the bread I had come for, and sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without starting the engine, watching my hands shake in a way I had not let myself shake in months. That night, alone in the small rental apartment I had signed a lease on with money I had quietly saved for years without Marcus ever asking where it came from, I sat down on the floor of my empty kitchen because I did not yet own a table, and I let myself feel the full weight of everything at once. The house. The friends. The market. The particular loneliness of building a life with someone for 9 years and discovering, in the space of a single autumn, that he had never really seen you at all, not the parts that mattered, not the parts you had spent years quietly becoming while he was busy becoming someone who found you less interesting than his own reflection. I cried harder that night than I had cried since finding the receipt, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there is a dishonesty in revenge stories that skip past the part where the protagonist actually breaks, as though strength only counts if it arrives without cost. My strength arrived with cost. I paid for it on the floor of an empty kitchen, wrapped in a coat because I had not yet figured out where the boxes with my blankets had ended up, crying in a way that felt less like sadness and more like a body finally being allowed to release something it had been holding for a very long time. But I want to tell you what happened after the crying stopped, because that is the part of the story that actually matters. Somewhere around midnight, sitting on that cold floor with my knees pulled up to my chest, I stopped crying and I started thinking, and the thoughts that came were not the thoughts of a woman who had lost everything. They were the thoughts of a woman taking inventory. I thought about the years I had spent practicing corporate law before I left, years that had taught me how to read a contract more carefully than the person who wrote it. I thought about the meticulous financial records I had kept out of old habit, the kind of habit a lawyer never fully unlearns, records that included things Marcus had no idea I had documented, transfers he had made to accounts under his brother's name, expenses he had quietly routed through the firm that had nothing to do with legal work. I thought about the kitchen ledger, about the 43,000 women in my membership community who had spent the last 2 years teaching me, in their own comment sections and messages, exactly how much smarter the average underestimated woman actually is than the men who underestimate her. And I thought, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after the exhaustion of the tears, about Fieldstone Row, the quiet holding company I had built without telling a single soul in my old life, the one that had spent the last 8 months acquiring small commercial properties and careful, unglamorous purchases that nobody had any reason to connect to me. I did not yet know, on that particular night, that one of those properties would turn out to be the building Marcus's firm called home. That discovery was still a few weeks away. But sitting on that kitchen floor, I made a decision that felt less like anger and more like a door finally opening after being stuck for years. I decided I was done absorbing things. I want to explain what I mean by that, because it is not the same as deciding to seek revenge, not exactly, not at first. What I mean is that for 9 years, and honestly for longer than that, for most of my adult life if I am being fully honest with you, I had developed a particular skill at absorbing things. Absorbing Marcus's dismissiveness about my work. Absorbing the small comments from his colleagues about how nice it must be to have so much free time. Absorbing the quiet, persistent message that my value in that marriage was measured by how well I supported his ambitions rather than by anything I built on my own. I had absorbed all of it so thoroughly that I had barely noticed myself doing it, the way you do not notice a low hum in a room until someone finally turns it off and the silence feels almost shocking. Sitting on that kitchen floor, I turned it off. The next morning, I called Renata Alvarez before I had even finished my coffee, and I told her that I wanted to properly value my business for the settlement, using real numbers, and that I needed her help finding a forensic accountant who could handle the kind of complexity my finances actually involved. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she asked me, carefully, exactly how complex we were talking about. I told her the truth. I told her about the kitchen ledger's actual revenue, numbers I had never spoken out loud to anyone in my old life because I had learned, somewhere along the way, that saying them too loudly around Marcus invited a particular kind of deflation, a joke about my little side project that made the numbers feel smaller than they were even as I said them. I told Renata everything, and I listened to her go quiet again, this time in a different way, the quiet of someone recalculating an entire case strategy in real time. "We need to talk to someone who specializes in business valuation for high net worth divorces," she said finally. "Do you know anyone?" I did know someone, as it turned out. My old law school roommate, a woman named Priya Nasser who had left corporate law 2 years before I did to become a forensic accountant, someone I had stayed loosely in touch with through the kind of friendship that survives on birthday texts and occasional phone calls but had never needed anything more urgent than that until now. I called her that same afternoon, and I remember the way her voice changed when I explained what Marcus had said in that conference room, the specific tone women get when they hear about another woman being underestimated in a way they recognize from their own lives. "Send me everything you have," Priya said. "Every bank statement, every tax return, every contract, every piece of correspondence about that blog going back to the day you started it. We are going to build a case so airtight that Marcus's own attorney is going to wonder why they ever agreed to that hobby line." I spent the following week gathering documents late into the night, sitting on the floor of my still mostly empty apartment surrounded by bankers' boxes I had rescued from the house before Marcus's exclusive use order took effect, and there was something almost sacred about that process, laying out years of quiet, careful work in neat piles across the carpet, proof of everything Marcus had never bothered to ask about. But rock bottom was not finished with me yet, not quite. 2 days before I was set to send Priya the full financial picture, I received a call from an unknown number that turned out to be a reporter for a regional business publication, asking whether I had a comment about a rumor circulating that my divorce involved allegations of infidelity on Marcus's part, and whether it was true that I had been, in the reporter's words, quote, "essentially a stay-at-home spouse for most of the marriage." I understood immediately where that framing had come from. I did not have proof, not the kind that would hold up anywhere, but I understood the shape of it well enough to recognize Marcus's fingerprints, or at least the fingerprints of someone close to him, someone shaping the narrative before the numbers could speak for themselves, painting me as a woman who had contributed nothing so that whatever settlement he was fighting for would look, to anyone watching, like simple fairness rather than the theft it actually was. I declined to comment. I hung up the phone, and I sat very still in my empty apartment, and for one long, terrible minute I let myself feel the fear underneath the anger, the fear that comes from realizing someone with more visibility and more community standing than you currently have has decided to control the story before you get the chance to tell your own version of it. And then I thought about the 43,000 women in my membership community, women who had spent 2 years reading my words at midnight while their own household slept, women who trusted me because I had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly who I was. I thought about Priya, already elbow-deep in my financial records, building something airtight out of years of quiet documentation. I thought about Renata, careful and unshowy and entirely unbothered by Marcus's team of 4 attorneys, because Renata had built her entire career on being underestimated by exactly that kind of confidence. I stopped being afraid somewhere in the middle of that minute, and what replaced the fear was not quite anger either. It was something steadier than anger, something that felt more like purpose. Marcus had spent our entire marriage assuming that whatever I built quietly did not count as building. He had called my life's work a hobby in a room full of lawyers, and now, apparently, someone close to him was trying to rewrite even the small, private grief of my marriage into a story where I had contributed nothing at all. I decided, sitting on that floor with my phone still warm in my hand from the reporter's call, that I was done letting other people write the story of what I was worth. I had spent 9 years letting Marcus define that number, and I had spent the 6 weeks since the divorce filing letting his silence, his lawyers, and now apparently his allies in the press try to define it further downward, and I was finished. The floor I finally found, the one beneath the rock bottom of that autumn, was not a floor made of self-pity. It was a floor made of decision. I sent Priya everything 2 days later, ahead of schedule, along with a note that said simply, "Let's show them exactly what 9 years of underestimating me actually cost." What came next did not happen quickly, and I want to be honest about that too, because satisfaction that arrives instantly rarely means as much as satisfaction that has to be built patiently, brick by brick, the way you build anything worth keeping. But something had shifted in me on that kitchen floor, and it did not shift back. I stopped waiting for Marcus to see me clearly. I started making sure he would not have a choice. Priya called me on a Tuesday morning with a voice that had the particular brightness of someone who has just found exactly what she was looking for. "I have something," she said, and I could hear papers shuffling on her end of the line, the sound of a woman who had spent the last several days living inside my financial history the way I once lived inside case files during my own years practicing law. "Your business valuation is airtight." But that's not even the interesting part. The interesting part is what I found buried in Marcus's disclosures. I sat down at the small table I had finally bought for my apartment, a second-hand piece from an estate sale that still smelled faintly of someone else's furniture polish, and I asked her what she meant. "There's an account under his brother Dean's name," Priya said. "Opened 4 years ago. Marcus has been routing money into it through what looks like a series of consulting payments from the firm, except Dean doesn't do any consulting work that I can find record of anywhere. The pattern started right around the time you two bought the lake house." I remembered the lake house well. Marcus had insisted, 3 years into our marriage, that we needed a property that was entirely his family's, something separate from anything I had brought into the marriage, and I had agreed because agreeing had always been easier than the alternative. I had never once suspected that the lake house itself might have been a smaller piece of a larger pattern, a habit of quietly moving assets sideways so that anything that ever needed dividing would already be diminished before the dividing began. "He's been doing this for years," Priya said. "Moving money through Dean, through a couple of shell entities that aren't hard to trace once you know to look, all of it timed suspiciously close to major purchases you two made together. I think he's been protecting assets against exactly this scenario for a long time. I think, and I want you to sit with this for a second before you react, I think Marcus planned for this divorce long before you found that hotel receipt." I sat with it. I let the thought settle into the parts of me that still remembered every year of our marriage in order, every purchase, every conversation about money that Marcus had always steered with a confidence I had once mistaken for competence rather than control. I thought about how he had handled our finances almost entirely on his own from the very beginning, how he had framed it as generosity, as sparing me the burden, when I had once practiced the kind of law that made me more than capable of handling any burden he could have named. "I am not surprised," I told Priya finally, and I realized as I said it that it was true. I was not surprised. I was simply, for the first time in a long while, fully informed. We built the case over the following 2 weeks with the kind of careful, unglamorous persistence that never makes it into the version of these stories people tell at parties. Priya traced every transfer. Renata drafted the emergency motion to properly value my business, attaching Priya's documentation like a woman laying bricks in a wall that was not going to move no matter how hard anyone leaned on it. I spent my nights compiling records, and my days, when I was not compiling records, running the kitchen ledger the way I always had, because I refused to let Marcus's disruption of my personal life bleed into the one part of my world he had never managed to touch. The first Real win came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after that phone call from the reporter I still could not prove Marcus had orchestrated. Renata filed the emergency motion, backed by Priya's full valuation report, into the court record, and included with it was a request that the court formally recognize the kitchen ledger as a marital business asset with a documented value of just over $1.1 million in annual revenue. Patricia Vance's response arrived within 48 hours, and Renata read it to me over the phone with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has just watched an opposing counsel's confidence crack in real time. Patricia had requested an emergency conference to, in her words, clarify the scope of the disclosed business interests, which Renata translated for me plainly. She said it means they had no idea, and now they're scrambling. I felt something that afternoon that I had not felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Not triumph exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the quiet satisfaction of watching a lie begin to buckle under the weight of documentation it could not withstand. The second win took a little more engineering, and I want to be honest that I planned this one rather than simply waiting for it to arrive, because I had learned, sitting on that kitchen floor months earlier, that waiting had cost me enough already. Marcus had spent years cultivating a particular kind of public reputation, the successful divorce attorney with the effortless charm, the man other lawyers wanted to be photographed next to at charity events. Part of that reputation included a personal sponsorship arrangement he had bragged about more than once at dinner parties, a deal with a men's lifestyle brand that wanted him as the face of their new professional apparel line, a deal that meant more to his ego than the money ever meant to his bank account, because it was proof, in his mind, that he had become the kind of man worth being associated with. I still had contacts from 3 years of building relationships in the influencer and brand partnership world through the kitchen ledger, women and men who trusted my judgment because I had never once steered them toward a bad decision. I made one phone call, to a marketing director I had worked with twice before on unrelated campaigns, a woman named Talia who happened to sit on the same brand's partnership committee. I did not ask her to do anything unethical. I simply mentioned, in the course of an otherwise unrelated conversation about an upcoming collaboration, that I had recently seen some concerning documentation about a business associate of hers involved in ongoing divorce litigation that included allegations of financial concealment, and that if her brand valued the kind of clean, trustworthy image it had built its identity around, it might be worth having someone on her team quietly review the public court filings before the campaign launched. I never mentioned Marcus by name. I did not have to. Talia was thorough, and 2 weeks later, the sponsorship was quietly shelved, with a brief internal memo citing a shift in campaign direction. Marcus, I would later learn from a mutual acquaintance who still spoke to me out of some lingering sense of loyalty, was furious in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific bruise to his pride, the sense that something he had considered a settled achievement had been taken away without explanation. The third win came directly from the deposition Priya had helped build the groundwork for, the one addressing the account under Dean's name. I sat across from Marcus in a smaller conference room this time, no Patricia Vance smiling confidently at the head of the table, just a court reporter, Renata beside me, and Marcus's face doing something I had not seen it do in the 9 years I had known him, a kind of careful, controlled panic that he was trying very hard to keep from showing. Renata walked him through the transfer slowly, methodically, the exact procedural rhythm Marcus himself had taught me to respect during the early years of our marriage, back when he used to talk about his cases at dinner and I used to listen, genuinely fascinated, learning without realizing I was learning. She asked him to explain the nature of Dean's consulting work. She asked him to produce any invoices, any deliverables, any evidence at all that actual services had been rendered in exchange for the payments. Marcus had none. He tried, for a while, to construct an explanation on the spot, something about informal advisory work, about family arrangements that did not require the same documentation as formal business relationships, and I watched him do it with an odd, detached calm, because I recognized the sound of a man improvising a defense he had never expected to need. I did not gloat in that room. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is a version of this story where the protagonist leans back and smiles the way Marcus once did across a different table, and I did not do that, not because I did not feel the temptation but because I had decided, somewhere in the weeks of building this case, that my satisfaction did not require his humiliation to be complete in front of witnesses. It required only that the truth exist clearly enough that no one in that room could pretend otherwise anymore. The deposition ended with the transfers formally entered into the record as concealed marital assets, and Renata told me afterward, walking out into the cold afternoon air, that this alone would likely shift the entire settlement calculation by a significant margin. I felt lighter walking out of that building than I had felt in over a year. Not because I had won, not yet, the settlement was still weeks from finalized, but because for the first time since finding that hotel receipt, I understood that the story was no longer being told entirely by Marcus and the people who had decided to believe him without asking a single hard question. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened that week, something smaller than the wins, something that had nothing to do with Marcus at all, because I think it matters for what comes later in this story. Priya, exhausted from weeks of forensic work on my behalf, refused to let me pay her anything beyond the standard rate we had agreed on at the start, and instead asked only that I meet her for dinner, just the two of us, no case files, no financial records, just an old friendship that had somehow survived law school and years of drifting and come back exactly when I needed it most. We sat at a small Italian restaurant near her office, and somewhere between the appetizer and the second glass of wine, she told me something I had not expected to hear. She told me that watching me build my case, watching me stay calm through depositions and betrayals and the quiet cruelty of a man rewriting the value of my own life in real time, had reminded her of exactly why she left corporate law herself. Not because the work was too hard, she said, but because she had spent years watching brilliant women get underestimated by men who mistook their own confidence for competence, and she had gotten tired of building cases for the wrong side. You were always the smartest person in every room you walked into, Priya said, and you spent 9 years letting a man convince you otherwise. I am glad you finally stopped. I did not have an answer for that right away. I simply sat there, in a small restaurant that smelled like garlic and candle wax, and let a friend's honesty land somewhere it needed to land, and I thought, not for the first time that week, that I had spent so long measuring my worth against Marcus's opinion of me that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly by someone who had never needed convincing. I did not know it yet, sitting at that table, but the next few weeks were going to bring a discovery that would change everything about how this story ended, a discovery that had nothing to do with hidden accounts or forensic accounting and everything to do with a piece of real estate I had acquired, quietly, months earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with Marcus at all. The lease renewal notice arrived on Marcus's desk on an ordinary Wednesday morning, and I would not learn about it for another 4 days, but I want to start there anyway, because there is something almost poetic about how quietly the biggest turn in this entire story began, buried in an envelope from a property management company neither Marcus nor I had ever bothered to research. I found out during a mediation session that had, up to that point, been proceeding along the same careful, grinding rhythm as every other meeting in this divorce, both sides trading documents and objections across a table while Renata and Patricia Vance spoke in the clipped, professional shorthand of people who had stopped being surprised by each other weeks earlier. Marcus's office manager, a soft-spoken man named Gary who occasionally accompanied him to these sessions to handle logistics, mentioned offhand to one of the paralegals that the firm's landlord had just raised the lease rate at renewal, and that Marcus was, in Gary's words, not thrilled about it. I was reviewing a document at the time, not really listening, the way you only half listen to conversations happening at the edges of a room you are not part of. But something in the sentence caught, the way certain words catch on certain days for reasons you cannot always explain in the moment, and I asked, casually, almost without thinking, who the landlord was. Gary said the name without any particular weight behind it, the way you say a fact you have never once had reason to examine closely. Fieldstone Row, he said. Some holding company. They've owned the building for a while now, I think, though the ownership only really changed hands with any noticeable difference in the last year or so. I did not react in that room. I want you to understand what it took not to react, sitting there with a pen still in my hand, hearing the name of my own company spoken by a man who had no idea he was speaking it in front of the woman who controlled it. I finished reviewing the document in front of me. I nodded at something Renata said a moment later. And underneath all of that careful, practiced calm, something in my chest went very still and very clear, the way water goes still right before you see all the way to the bottom of it for the first time. Fieldstone Row was mine. Not mine and Marcus's, not a marital asset subject to division, but mine entirely, built in the 18 months since I had found that hotel receipt, funded by revenue from a business Marcus had called a hobby in a room full of attorneys. I had spent those months acquiring small commercial properties around the city with the same quiet, unglamorous persistence I had once used to build my membership community, one careful purchase at a time, never announcing any of it, never needing anyone's approval for a decision that was entirely my own to make. I had known, in the vague way you know facts about your own holdings without keeping every detail actively in mind, that Fieldstone Row owned several office buildings downtown. I had not connected any of those buildings to Marcus's firm, because I had never once asked Marcus which building he worked out of after the divorce filing, having long since stopped caring about the geography of his professional life. It was only sitting in that mediation room, hearing Gary say the name of my own company out loud, that the two facts collided in my mind and settled into a single, undeniable truth. I was Marcus's landlord. I did not say anything to anyone that day, not even Renata, not yet, because I wanted to be certain before I built anything on top of a fact I had only just discovered. I called my property manager that evening, a careful, discreet man named Oscar who had handled Fieldstone Ro's acquisitions from the beginning and understood, without ever being told explicitly, that discretion was part of what I was paying him for. "I need you to confirm something for me," I told him. "The building on Layton Avenue, the one we acquired last spring. Who are the current tenants on the third and fourth floors?" Oscar pulled up the file while I waited, and I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching the evening light fade over a city that suddenly felt smaller and stranger than it had that morning. He read off the tenant name, and I heard it exactly the way I already knew I would hear it: Whitfield and Associates, a boutique family and divorce law practice that had signed its current lease 11 months earlier, shortly after Marcus went independent from his previous firm. I thanked Oscar and hung up the phone, and I stood alone in my kitchen for a long time, longer than the moment probably required, simply absorbing the strange, quiet symmetry of it. Marcus had spent months trying to convince a courtroom that the business I built was worth nothing, and that same business, indirectly, through years of careful decisions he had never once thought to ask about, now owned the very roof over the office where he had made that argument. I did not go to the mediation team with this information right away. I wanted, first, to understand exactly what I was holding, and to decide what kind of person I wanted to be with it. There is a version of this discovery that leads immediately to spectacle, to a dramatic reveal delivered in front of witnesses for maximum humiliation, and I considered that version, briefly, in the privacy of my own kitchen, because I would be lying if I told you the thought did not cross my mind and did not feel, for a moment, deeply satisfying to imagine. But I kept coming back to something Priya had said to me over dinner weeks earlier, about how I had spent 9 years letting Marcus define my worth, and I realized that if I turned this discovery into a public spectacle, I would be doing something uncomfortably close to what Marcus himself had always done, using power to perform dominance in front of an audience rather than to simply establish the truth. I did not want to be that. I had built Fieldstone Row quietly, without needing anyone to witness it, and I decided the way I used this particular piece of it should be quiet too. I requested a private meeting with Marcus, just the two of us, no attorneys present, which Renata was hesitant about until I explained exactly what I intended to do with it, at which point her hesitation turned into something closer to quiet admiration. Marcus agreed to the meeting with the same slightly bored confidence he brought to everything involving me by that point in the process, the assumption that whatever I wanted to discuss would be some minor procedural matter he could dispense with quickly before returning to more important things. We met at a small coffee shop near the courthouse, neutral ground, and I arrived early enough to choose the table, a habit left over from my own years practicing law, where you always want to be the one already seated when the other side walks in. Marcus sat down across from me with his coffee, glanced at his watch in the way that had once made me feel small and now simply registered as information, a man perpetually performing busyness as a form of status. "I want to be quick about this, Dana," he said. "I've got a client at 11. I did not rush. I want you to understand that clearly, because the pacing of what happened next mattered as much as the content of it." I reached into my bag and set 2 documents on the table between us, side by side, smoothing each one flat with 2 fingers the same way I had once smoothed a hotel receipt flat on our dinner table a lifetime ago. The first document was the settlement proposal his team had submitted weeks earlier, the one that valued my business at essentially nothing and proposed dividing our remaining assets in a way that heavily favored him. The second document was the commercial lease for the office space occupied by Whitfield and Associates, with the ownership entity listed clearly on the first page. Fieldstone Row Holdings LLC. Marcus looked at the second document for a moment without immediately understanding what he was looking at, the way you look at something familiar in an unfamiliar context and need a beat to place it. I watched the exact moment recognition arrived, watched something shift behind his eyes as he connected the name on the lease to the small, unglamorous acquisitions he had heard about only in passing, if at all, and then further connected that name to me. "You own this building," he said slowly, not quite a question. "I own several buildings," I told him, keeping my voice level, keeping it warm even, because I was not there to perform cruelty, only clarity. "This one happens to be the one you signed a lease for 11 months ago. I found out 4 days ago, the same way you're finding out right now, from someone mentioning your lease renewal in a room where nobody realized who was listening." Marcus set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way people set things down when their hands have suddenly become less steady than they want them to appear. "I am not here to gloat," I told him, and I meant it, though I understood he might not believe me, given everything. "I am not interested in destroying your firm or making your life difficult out of spite. I am interested in exactly one thing, which is being paid what I am actually owed for 9 years of building a life alongside you, a life that included a business you called worthless in front of 2 attorneys and a court reporter." I let that sentence sit in the space between us for a moment before continuing. "You can keep negotiating in bad faith," I said. "You can keep trying to convince a judge that what I built has no value. But I want you to think very carefully about whether that is a negotiating strategy you want to continue using with the woman who now owns your office space, because I promise you, Marcus, I am not going to be the one who runs out of patience first." He did not say anything for a long moment. I watched him look down at the lease again, then back up at me, and what crossed his face in that silence was not the irritation I had grown so familiar with over the course of this divorce, not the practiced confidence he wore into every conference room like armor. It was something quieter and more exposed, the specific expression of a man realizing, all at once, that he had built an entire legal strategy on the assumption that I was smaller than I actually was, and that the assumption had just collapsed in front of him with no warning at all. "I am not trying to hurt you," I told him again, more gently this time, because some part of me, even after everything, still remembered the man who used to bring me coffee in the mornings without being asked, still wanted him to understand that this was not about revenge in the way revenge is usually understood. "I just stopped agreeing to be smaller than I am. That's all this has ever been." Marcus did not respond right away. He sat there, in that small coffee shop, staring at a lease agreement with my company's name printed clearly at the top of it, and for the first time in the entire length of our marriage and our divorce combined, he looked at me the way you look at someone you have just realized you never actually knew at all. I gathered the 2 documents, slid them back into my bag, and stood up before he had found any words to offer in response. There was nothing else that needed saying in that room. The numbers would do the rest of the talking in the weeks that followed, and I walked out of that coffee shop into a bright, ordinary afternoon, feeling lighter than I had felt in over a year, not because I had won something from Marcus, but because I finally understood, standing on that sidewalk in the same neutral, unremarkable part of the city where I had once been so afraid of what a divorce would cost me, that I had never actually needed him to see my worth in the first place. I only needed to stop needing it. Marcus's firm relocated 8 months after that conversation in the coffee shop, a fact I did not learn from him directly but from Oscar, who mentioned it the way he mentioned most business matters, briefly and without ceremony, during a routine call about the Layton Avenue property. Whitfield and Associates broke their lease early, paid the penalty, and moved into a smaller office across town, one with a landlord Marcus had never met and had no complicated history with. I understood why he made that choice. I would have made it too, in his position. There is a particular kind of discomfort in paying rent every month to someone you once dismissed in front of a room full of attorneys, a discomfort that compounds every time you sign the check. The settlement itself was finalized 4 months after the coffee shop conversation, and it looked nothing like the proposal Marcus's team had submitted at the start. My business was valued accurately, backed by PRIA's documentation, and factored properly into the division of our marital assets. The concealed transfers to Dean's account were treated exactly as what they were, an attempt to shield resources from fair division, and the court's final order reflected that. I did not walk away from that marriage wealthy because of what Marcus lost. I walked away from it having finally been paid what I had always been owed, which is a different thing entirely, and a more important one. Chelsea, I heard through the same loose network of mutual acquaintances that had once carried whispers about hotel receipts and country club dinners, found the year that followed harder than she had expected. She had married Marcus, or was preparing to, believing she was stepping into the same effortless, golden professional life I had once occupied, the nice house, the reliable income, the easy confidence of a man who always seemed to have somewhere important to be. What she got instead was a fiancé whose income had taken a real and lasting hit from the settlement, whose firm had shrunk rather than grown, and whose pride, I suspect, made those changes even harder to live with than the numbers themselves would have been on their own. I do not say this with satisfaction, not exactly. I say it because it is true, and because there is something instructive in it for anyone listening who has ever believed that stepping into someone else's unraveling marriage guarantees you the version of their life you saw from the outside. I want to spend the rest of this chapter, though, on something that has nothing to do with Marcus at all, because the truest ending to this story was never really about him. It was about what I built once I stopped organizing my life around his approval, and it started, unexpectedly, with a building on Layton Avenue that needed more work than Oscar and I had originally planned for. The property required a full renovation of its ground floor retail space before we could bring in a new tenant, and Oscar recommended a contractor named Sam Delgado, a quiet, steady man in his late 30s who had done reliable work on 2 other Fieldstone Row properties without ever once trying to charge us for more than the job actually required, which Oscar assured me was rarer in his industry than it should have been. I met Sam for the first time on a Tuesday morning in early spring, standing in an empty retail space that still smelled like old paint and dust, and I remember being struck by how unremarkable that first meeting was, how little fanfare surrounded the beginning of something that would eventually matter so much. Sam walked me through the space, pointing out load-bearing walls and outdated wiring, explaining each recommendation clearly and without any of the condescension I had grown so used to bracing myself for in rooms full of men discussing things they assumed I would not understand. When I asked a technical question about the electrical panel, he did not simplify his answer or look faintly surprised that I had asked it at all. He simply answered it, the way you answer a question from anyone you assume is capable of understanding the response. I did not think much of that first meeting beyond noting, with a kind of quiet relief, that I had found a contractor I trusted. It was only over the following months, as the renovation progressed and I found myself stopping by the property more often than strictly necessary to check on progress I could have easily gotten updates about over email, that I started to understand what was actually happening. Sam never made me feel like I needed to explain or justify my own worth to him. He never asked why a woman was overseeing a commercial renovation, never directed technical questions toward Oscar instead of me out of some assumption that I was simply the money behind the operation rather than a person with my own understanding of what I wanted built. He talked to me the way you talk to someone you consider fully equal to the conversation, and after 9 years of marriage to a man who had rarely managed that, it took me longer than I am proud of to recognize how significant that steadiness actually was. We started having coffee together after our site visits, nothing that either of us named as anything beyond 2 people who worked well together taking a reasonable break from a long morning. I found myself looking forward to those mornings in a way that surprised me, not because Sam said particularly dramatic things, he did not, he was not a man given to grand declarations, but because of the specific, unglamorous comfort of sitting across from someone who never once made me feel like I was too much or too little of anything. It was Sam who first mentioned, almost in passing, over coffee on a rainy Thursday about 6 months after we met, that he had noticed I always seemed to relax a little once we got past the first 10 minutes of any conversation, as though I spent those first 10 minutes waiting for something to go wrong. I did not have a quick answer for that observation. I sat with it for a long moment, watching rain streak down the coffee shop window. And then I told him, more honestly than I had told most people outside my closest circle, about Marcus, about the conference room, about 9 years of learning to brace myself before anyone gave their honest opinion of what I was worth. Sam listened. He did not offer advice I had not asked for, did not try to fix anything or perform sympathy in a way that centered his own reaction instead of my experience. He simply listened, the way he had listened to every technical question I had ever asked him about that building, fully, without impatience, as though what I had to say actually mattered to him. That's a hard way to spend 9 years, he said finally, quietly, and something about the simplicity of that sentence landed somewhere in me that months of legal victories had not quite reached. I did not fall in love with Sam Delgado in a single dramatic moment, and I think that is exactly why what grew between us has lasted in a way my marriage never did. It grew slowly, the way trust grows when it is not being rushed by anyone's need for it to arrive quickly, built out of specific things rather than grand gestures. It grew out of the way he remembered, without being reminded, that I preferred my coffee with just a little bit of cream. It grew out of the evening he drove 40 minutes out of his way to bring me dinner after Oscar mentioned offhand that I had been at the property until nearly 9 o'clock reviewing final inspection reports and probably hadn't eaten. It grew out of the quiet, steady fact that Sam Delgado never once, in all the months I came to know him, made me feel like I needed to shrink any part of myself to make the relationship comfortable for him. We are together now, quietly, the same way everything good in my life has grown since that autumn I finally stopped absorbing what other people decided I was worth. He does not read my blog every day, and I have made my peace with that, because he does ask me thoughtful questions about it over dinner, and he showed up, unannounced but exactly on time, to the small in-person event I held last spring for members of my community, standing quietly at the back of the room, and I remember looking out at 40 women gathered together because of something I had built with my own 2 hands, and finding his face in the crowd, and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could measure, completely and entirely at peace with the life in front of me. I still get messages, most weeks, from women who found the kitchen ledger during their own divorces, women who ask me some version of the same question. How did you know what you were worth before anyone else did? I always give them the same honest answer. I did not know, not at first. I spent years believing the number someone else had assigned me, believing it so thoroughly that I barely noticed myself shrinking to fit inside it. What changed was not some sudden discovery of my own worth. What changed was that I finally got tired enough, sitting on the floor of an empty kitchen one autumn night, to stop letting anyone else hold the pen on that particular story. If you are listening to this and you recognize some version of yourself in what I have described, in the exhaustion of being underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you best, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need anyone's permission to stop absorbing what does not belong to you. You do not need a courtroom victory or a building with your name quietly attached to its deed to know what you are actually worth. Those things helped me, I will not pretend otherwise, but the real turn in this story happened months before any of it, on a kitchen floor, in the quiet decision to stop being smaller than I actually was. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself nodding along at parts of it that felt uncomfortably familiar, I would love for you to stay with me a while longer. Subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories like mine waiting here, more women who found their own floor and built something new on top of it, and I promise you, every single one of them is worth hearing. Turn on notifications if you want to know the moment a new story goes up, because I post regularly, and I read every comment you leave, even when I cannot always reply to each one. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest, because I read those too, more closely than you might expect, and I have built an entire community out of exactly those conversations. I will see you in the next one.